The gun felt like a piece of iron pulled from hell itself. Jacob Brennan stared at it lying on the rough wooden table in front of him. A Colt Peacemaker, .45 caliber, bone handle worn smooth from 15 years of use. His gun. The one he had sworn he would never touch again. It was October of 1884, and the small frontier town of Cedar Falls, Wyoming, was dying in the golden autumn light outside the window of the boarding house. But Jacob wasn't looking at the town. He was looking at his hands. They were shaking. Not a tremor. A full, uncontrollable shake that started at his wrists and traveled up through his forearms until his entire body felt like it was coming apart at the seams. The same shake that had started 3 years ago, the morning after Willow Creek. He closed his eyes and saw it again. The smoke. The screams. The bodies of men he had killed lying in the dirt of a sun-baked Texas street. And the one face that never left him, a young deputy, barely 20 years old, reaching for a gun he never should have drawn, his eyes wide with terror in the half-second before Jacob's bullet tore through his chest. Jacob had walked away from that town, walked away from the reputation, walked away from the name that had once been spoken in the same breath as Wild Bill Hickok and John Wesley Hardin. Jacob Quick Draw Brennan. The fastest gun in 3 territories. The man who had never lost a fight. He had buried the gun in a wooden chest, locked it, and walked north until he found a town so small and forgotten that no one knew his name. He had taken work as a carpenter, building fences and barns, keeping his head down, speaking to no one, drinking alone in his room at night until the shaking stopped long enough for him to sleep. He hadn't touched a gun in 3 years. And now there was one sitting in front of him, placed there by the smallest, most impossible messenger he could have imagined. A 10-year-old girl with dirt on her face and her father's blood still on her dress. Her name was Emma Coltrane. She stood across the table from him now, thin as a willow branch, with tangled brown hair and eyes that were far too old for her age. She had ridden 15 miles alone through the Wyoming wilderness to find him. She had asked every person in Cedar Falls if they knew where the carpenter lived. She had climbed the stairs to his boarding house room, knocked on his door, and when he opened it, she had looked up at him with those ancient, exhausted eyes and said 5 words that shattered the fragile peace he had built. "They killed my father, mister." Now she stood in his room, small hands clasped in front of her, watching him stare at the gun she had placed on his table, the gun she had somehow known he owned, the gun she had begged him to pick up. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "You're the only one left who can help us." Jacob looked at her. Then he looked back at the gun. His hands were still shaking. "I can't," he said, his voice a hollow, gravelly rasp. "I'm not that man anymore." "Yes, you are," Emma said. She took a step closer. Tears were streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks now, but her voice didn't waver. "My papa told me about you before he died. He said if anything ever happened, I should find Jacob Brennan. He said you were the only man in the whole West who could stand up to the Crowley brothers." Jacob's jaw tightened at the name. The Crowley brothers. Dalton, Carson, and Reed Crowley. A family of killers who had terrorized the cattle towns of Colorado and Wyoming for 5 years, robbing banks, burning homesteads, and leaving bodies in their wake. The law couldn't touch them. They moved too fast, killed too efficiently, and had half the local sheriffs on their payroll. Jacob had heard the stories. Everyone had. He stood up slowly, turning away from the table, away from the girl, away from the gun. "Your father was wrong," Jacob said quietly. "I can't help you. I can't help anyone. Not anymore." He heard Emma move behind him. He expected her to cry, to beg, to scream. Instead, she did something that broke him more completely than any of those things could have. She picked up the gun from the table, and she held it out to him with both small, trembling hands. "My mama is still alive," Emma whispered. "But they took her. Dalton Crowley said if the town doesn't give him the deed to the land where the railroad is coming through, he's going to kill her." The sheriff ran away. The mayor locked himself in his house. "Nobody is coming to help us, Mr. Brennan." Her voice broke. "Please, I don't have anybody else to ask." Jacob, turn around. The little girl was holding his gun like it weighed more than she did, offering it to him with tears pouring down her face, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and grief, and a 10-year-old's understanding that the world was not fair and that sometimes the only thing standing between life and death was whether or not a broken man could find the courage to pick up the thing that had destroyed him. Jacob stared at the gun in her hands. He stared at the girl. And for the first time in 3 years, he reached out. His hand was shaking so badly he almost couldn't grip the handle. But he took it. The town of Salvation Ridge sat in a narrow valley 15 miles south of Cedar Falls, pressed between the Medicine Bow Mountains and a slow-moving creek that had once run clean but now carried the gray runoff of abandoned prospecting claims. It had been a cattle town once, then a mining town. Now it was a ghost town in waiting. 200 souls clung to life there, most of them families who had nowhere else to go. The general store was half empty. The church had lost its preacher to tuberculosis. The schoolhouse had 3 students left. But everything was about to change. 3 months ago, surveyors from the Union Pacific Railroad had ridden through the valley and marked the land with wooden stakes and red flags. The new western expansion line was coming through Salvation Ridge. The town that had been dying would suddenly become a critical junction point, a place where cattle, timber, and ore would be loaded onto trains heading east. Land that had been worth $5 an acre was now worth $500. The railroad company had sent representatives to negotiate land purchases with the town council. Fair prices. Legal contracts. The future looked brighter than it had in a decade. And then the Crowley brothers arrived. Dalton Crowley was the oldest, 38, broad-shouldered, with the cold, flat eyes of a man who had been killing since he was 16. He wore expensive black suits taken from the bodies of men he had robbed, and he smiled when he spoke, which made him more terrifying than his younger brothers, who at least had the decency to look like the animals they were. Carson Crowley, 34, was the enforcer. He was massive, 6'5", built like a bull, with fists that could break a man's jaw with one punch, and a temper that could be triggered by a wrong look or a hesitation in following orders. Reed Crowley, the youngest at 29, was the wild card. He was thin, wiry, and quick, with a nervous energy that made him unpredictable. He laughed at inappropriate times. He shot people for sport. He was the one you watched when the other 2 weren't moving. The Crowleys didn't negotiate. They rode into Salvation Ridge one morning in late September with 8 hired guns and made a simple announcement in the town square. Every property owner in the town would sign over their land deeds to Dalton Crowley for $1 per acre. In exchange, the Crowleys would protect the town from bandits and ensure smooth relations with the railroad. Anyone who refused would be removed. The mayor, a timber merchant named Horace Webb, had tried to stand up to them. He had called a town meeting. He had written a letter to the territorial governor. He had even attempted to organize the men of the town into a militia. Dalton Crowley had responded by burning down Horace Webb's lumber mill in the middle of the night and beating him unconscious in the street in front of his wife and children. The letter to the governor never made it to the post office. The courier was found dead on the road with a bullet in his back. The sheriff, a man named Tom Fairchild, had ridden to the nearest federal marshal's office in Cheyenne, a 3-day trip to request assistance. He never came back. His horse returned to town alone, saddled and riderless. One by one, the families of Salvation Ridge signed over their deeds. All except one. Daniel Coltrane was a cattle rancher who owned 300 acres on the western edge of the valley, land that sat directly in the path of the proposed rail line. He was a stubborn, principled man who believed that a man's land was his legacy and that no amount of threats could make him surrender what his father had bled to build. He refused to sign. Dalton Crowley gave him 3 days to reconsider. On the morning of the 4th day, Daniel Coltrane was shot dead in his own barn while his 10-year-old daughter Emma watched from the hayloft. His wife, Sarah, had tried to run. Carson Crowley caught her before she reached the tree line. They dragged her back to town and locked her in the empty jailhouse. Dalton stood on the steps of the general store and made another announcement. Sarah Coltrane would be hanged in 3 days unless the town council signed over the Coltrane land to him, along with a formal endorsement making Dalton Crowley the official land agent for all railroad negotiations. The council met that night. They voted unanimously to comply. But before the papers could be signed, Emma Coltrane slipped out of the house where she was staying with a neighbor, stole a horse from the livery, and rode through the night to find the one man her father had always said could stand up to men like the Crowleys. The man her father had once met years ago in a cattle town in Colorado. A man named Jacob Brennan. Jacob and Emma rode south through the golden autumn foothills in near silence. Emma sat behind him on the saddle, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her head resting against his back. She had barely slept in 2 days. Exhaustion was finally overtaking grief. Jacob kept his eyes on the trail, his jaw set, his mind churning. The gun was tucked into his belt, a cold, familiar weight he had forgotten. His hands were still shaking, but they were hidden now, wrapped around the reins. As they rode, the memories came flooding back. Willow Creek, Texas, 1881. Jacob had been hired as a deputy marshal to bring in a gang of cattle rustlers who had been terrorizing ranches along the Brazos River. It was supposed to be a clean operation, corner the gang in town, make the arrest, transport them to trial. But the rustlers had heard the law was coming. They had barricaded themselves in a saloon, taken hostages, and vowed to shoot their way out. The town marshal, an old veteran named Sam Ridley, had tried to negotiate. The rustlers responded by shooting him in the chest and throwing his body into the street. That's when Jacob stepped in. He walked into that saloon alone. What happened in the next 3 minutes became legend. 7 men, 7 shots, 7 bodies on the floor. Jacob walked out without a scratch, the hostages unharmed, the gang dead before they understood what had hit them. The town called him a hero. But what they didn't see was the 8th man, a young deputy named Colin Hayes, barely 20 years old, who had been stationed outside the saloon to keep the crowd back. In the chaos and smoke after the gunfight, Colin had rushed through the door, gun drawn, yelling something Jacob couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Jacob had spun, instinct taking over, and fired. The bullet caught Colin Hayes in the chest before Jacob's mind registered that the young man wasn't a threat. Colin had died in the dirt outside the saloon, coughing blood, staring up at Jacob with confused, terrified eyes, asking one question over and over. Why? Jacob had knelt beside him, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to explain, but the words wouldn't come. By the time the doctor arrived, Colin was gone. The inquest ruled it a justified shooting. Chaos of battle. Reasonable mistake. Jacob was cleared of all charges. But he couldn't clear himself. He started drinking. The shaking started. He couldn't sleep without seeing Colin's face. He couldn't hold a gun without feeling the weight of the mistake. 2 months later, he walked away from the badge, buried the gun, and disappeared. Mr. Brennan? Emma's small voice pulled him back to the present. Yeah, kid. Were you scared? When you were a gunfighter? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Every time, he said finally. Then why did you do it? He didn't have a good answer for that. So he told her the only truth he had left. Because somebody had to. They reached the ridge overlooking Salvation Ridge just before sunset. Jacob pulled the horse to a stop and looked down at the town below. Smoke rose from chimneys. Oil lamps glowed in windows. On the surface, it looked peaceful. But Jacob could see the truth beneath. The streets were empty. No children playing. No men gathering outside the saloon. The town was holding its breath, waiting for the axe to fall. Emma stirred behind him. That's the jailhouse, she said quietly, pointing to a small stone building at the far end of the main street. That's where they're keeping my mama. Jacob studied the building. 2 guards outside. Rifles. Watching the street. How many Crowleys are in town? Jacob asked. All 3, Emma said. They're staying at the hotel. They got 8 other men with them. 11 armed men. Jacob felt the familiar cold weight settle into his chest. You should stay here, Jacob said. No, Emma said immediately. I'm coming with you. Jacob turned the saddle to look at her. Her face was set with the kind of stubborn determination that reminded him of every soldier he had ever served with who refused to stay behind when the bullets started flying. Emma, Jacob said quietly, if I go down there, people are going to die. I know, Emma said. Her eyes were clear and steady. But my mama is down there, and I'm not leaving her. Jacob looked at the girl for a long moment. Then he sighed and turned back to the trail. Stay close to me, he said. And when I tell you to run, you run. Understand? Emma nodded. They rode down into Salvation Ridge as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Jacob rode slowly down the main street of Salvation Ridge with Emma behind him. Every window along the street had a face pressed against it. Every door cracked open slightly. The town was watching. Jacob kept his eyes forward, his hand resting casually on his thigh, close to the gun, but not threatening. Not yet. He stopped the horse in front of the general store and dismounted. He helped Emma down and handed her the reins. Stay with the horse, Jacob said quietly. Emma nodded, but her eyes were locked on the jailhouse down the street. Jacob walked to the center of the street and stopped. He stood there in the fading twilight, hands loose at his sides, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. The door of the hotel swung open, and Dalton Crowley stepped out onto the porch. He was exactly what Jacob expected. Expensive black suit, polished boots, a gun belt slung low on his hip with a pearl-handled revolver. His face was handsome in the way a snake is handsome, all smooth lines and cold, calculating intelligence. Behind him came Carson and Reed, flanked by 4 hired guns. Dalton walked slowly down the hotel steps and stopped 20 feet from Jacob, studying him with those flat, dead eyes. "You must be lost, friend," Dalton said pleasantly. "This town isn't safe for strangers right now." "I'm not lost," Jacob said. "Then you're either very brave or very stupid," Dalton replied. He tilted his head slightly. "Do I know you?" "No." "You sure?" Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Something familiar about you." Jacob said nothing. Dalton smiled slowly. "You're here for the woman." "I'm here to take her home," Jacob said. The smile widened. "I'm afraid that's not possible. Mrs. Coltrane is being held on charges of conspiracy to defraud a legal land transaction. She'll face trial in 3 days." "There's no judge in this town," Jacob said. "I'm the judge," Dalton replied. "Then you're a liar and a murderer," Jacob said evenly. "And you're going to release her." Now, the street went deathly silent. Carson Crowley took a step forward, his massive hand dropping to his gun. Reed laughed, a high nervous sound that echoed off the buildings. Dalton held up one hand, stopping them. He studied Jacob for a long moment, his smile fading into something colder. "You got a name, friend?" Dalton asked. Jacob hesitated. He hadn't spoken his real name aloud in 3 years. But there was no point in hiding anymore. "Jacob Brennan," he said. The reaction was immediate. One of the hired guns took an involuntary step backward. Carson's hand moved away from his gun. Reed stopped laughing. Dalton's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a recalculation happening at high speed. "Jacob Brennan," Dalton repeated slowly. "Quick draw, Brennan. The man who killed 7 men in Willow Creek." He paused. "I heard you disappeared." "I did," Jacob said. "And now you're back." Dalton's smile returned, but it was thinner now. "For a woman you don't even know. For a little girl who asked me for help," Jacob corrected. Dalton glanced past Jacob toward the general store, where Emma stood clutching the horse's reins, staring at them with wide, terrified eyes. Dalton said, "The Coltrane girl. Persistent little thing." He looked back at Jacob. "Tell me something, Brennan. Are you as fast as they say?" Jacob didn't answer. "Because I've got 11 men in this town," Dalton continued. "You're one man. A famous man, sure. A fast man. But still just one." He spread his hands. "Even if you kill me, and that's a big if, my brothers and my boys will cut you down before you take 2 steps. And then that little girl will watch you die, just like she watched her father die." Jacob's jaw tightened. "So here's my offer," Dalton said. "Turn around. Ride out of here. Take the girl with you. Forget you ever heard of Salvation Ridge, and I'll let you live." Jacob looked at Dalton Crowley for a long moment. Then he looked past him, at Carson and Reed, at the hired guns, at the jailhouse where Sarah Coltrane was being held. He thought about the gun at his hip. He thought about his shaking hands. He thought about Colin Hayes dying in the dirt, asking why. And then he thought about Emma, standing behind him, holding the reins of a horse, waiting to see if the world was a place where people helped each other or a place where the strong devoured the weak. Jacob looked back at Dalton. "No," he said simply. Dalton's smile vanished. "Then you're a dead man," Dalton said. "Maybe," Jacob replied. "But she goes free first." The street was silent. Dalton stared at Jacob for a long, measured moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the hotel. "Lock him up," Dalton called over his shoulder. "Put him in the cell next to the woman. We'll hang them both tomorrow." 4 hired guns moved forward, rifles raised. Jacob didn't move. "Mr. Brennan!" Emma screamed from behind him. Jacob raised his hand slowly. "It's all right, Emma," he called back. "Stay with the horse." The hired guns surrounded him, taking his gun, binding his hands. As they dragged him toward the jailhouse, Jacob looked back once. Emma was still standing there, tears streaming down her face, watching them take away the last person in the world who had tried to help her. Jacob looked away. He had failed her, just like he failed everyone. The jailhouse cell was small, dark, and smelled of rust and old sweat. Jacob sat on the floor with his back against the cold stone wall, wrists bound, staring at the iron bars separating him from the adjacent cell where Sarah Coltrane sat huddled in the corner. She was a woman in her early 30s, thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes and a dress that was torn and stained. But her eyes were sharp, and when she looked at Jacob, there was no despair in them, only exhausted determination. "You're Jacob Brennan," Sarah said quietly. "Yeah. My husband spoke about you once," Sarah continued. "He met you in Colorado years ago. Said you were the fastest draw he ever saw." She paused. "He also said you were a good man." Jacob said nothing. "Emma told you what happened?" Sarah asked. "She told me." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, grief washing over her face before she forced it back down. "She shouldn't have come to find you," Sarah said. "She should have stayed safe. She came because she loves you," Jacob said, "and because nobody else would help." Sarah looked at him. "Will you?" Jacob stared at the floor. "I don't know if I can," he said finally. Sarah frowned. "I don't understand." Jacob took a slow breath. Then, for the first time in 3 years, he told someone the truth. He told her about Willow Creek, about the 7 men he killed, about colonnades, about the shaking that started and never stopped, about burying the gun because he couldn't trust himself to hold it anymore. "I'm not the man your husband remembered," Jacob said quietly. "That man is gone." Sarah listened in silence. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke. "My husband was not a violent man," Sarah said. "But when Emma was born, he bought a rifle. He learned to shoot. He practiced until he could hit a target at 100 yards. She paused. "He wasn't a gunfighter. But he was willing to be, if it meant protecting his daughter." "Do you know why?" Jacob looked up. "Because fear doesn't mean you can't do the thing that needs doing," Sarah said. "It just means it costs more." Jacob stared at her. "You made a mistake," Sarah continued. "A terrible mistake. And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since. But Emma didn't ride 15 miles through the wilderness to find a perfect man, Mr. Brennan. She rode to find a man who would try." Before Jacob could respond, the jailhouse door opened. Emma stepped inside. Jacob's heart dropped. "Emma, what are you?" "I brought you something," Emma interrupted. She walked quickly to the cell bars, her small face set with determination. In her hands, she held a ring of keys. Jacob stared. "Where did you get those?" he asked. "The guards were drinking," Emma said. "I snuck around back and took them from the hook." She slid the keys through the bars. "You have to get my mama out." Jacob picked up the keys with bound hands. "Emma, listen to me." "No," Emma said fiercely. "You listen to me, Mr. Brennan. My papa is dead. The sheriff ran away. The mayor is hiding. Everybody in this town is too scared to help us. But you came. You stood up to Dalton Crowley even though you were scared, even though your hands shake." Her voice cracked. "You're the only grown-up who didn't run away." Jacob looked at the 10-year-old girl standing in front of him with tears on her face and steel in her eyes. And something inside him, something that had been buried under 3 years of guilt and fear, cracked open. He stood up slowly. "Emma," he said quietly, "when I unlock this door, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Run," Jacob said. "Find somewhere safe and hide. Don't come out until this is over." "Can you do that?" Emma hesitated. Then she nodded. Jacob turned to Sarah. "When I get you out, you take Emma and you run," Jacob said. "There's a horse at the livery. Get on it and ride north. Don't stop. Don't look back." "What about you?" Sarah asked. Jacob looked down at his shaking hands. Then he unlocked his cell door. "I'm going to finish this," he said. Jacob walked out of the jailhouse into the cold night air, with Sarah and Emma behind him. The street was dark and empty. Oil lamps glowed in the windows of the hotel where the Crowley brothers were staying. Jacob stopped at the edge of the street. "Go," he said to Sarah without turning around. "No." Sarah hesitated, then grabbed Emma's hand and ran toward the livery. Jacob stood alone in the dark street, staring at the hotel. His hands were shaking. He reached down slowly and pulled the Colt from his belt. The gun Emma had brought him, the gun he had taken from the guards, the gun that felt like holding a piece of his own damnation. He raised it. The barrel wavered in the lamplight, shaking so badly he couldn't hold it steady. Jacob closed his eyes. He saw Colin Hayes' face. He heard the boy's voice asking why. And then he heard another voice. Emma's voice, small and fierce and unbroken. "You're the only grown-up who didn't run away." Jacob opened his eyes. He took a slow breath, and he steadied his hand. The shaking didn't stop completely, but it slowed. Enough. Jacob walked across the street toward the hotel. He kicked the door open. Inside, the main room was lit by oil lamps. Dalton Crowley sat at a table playing cards with Reed. Carson stood by the bar with 3 hired guns, drinking whiskey. Every head turned toward the door. Jacob stood in the doorway, gun raised, aimed directly at Dalton's chest. "It's over," Jacob said. Dalton stared at him. Then he started laughing. "You escaped," Dalton said. "Impressive. But you're still one man, Brennan." He gestured to the room. "And I'm looking at 5 others right here, plus 3 more upstairs. Then they're all going to die," Jacob said calmly. Carson took a step forward. "Big talk for a man whose hands are shaking like leaves." Jacob didn't take his eyes off Dalton. "Yeah," Jacob said. "They are. But I only need them steady for about 3 seconds." The room went silent. Dalton's smile faded. "You won't pull that trigger," Dalton said. "I know your story, Brennan. I know about Willow Creek. You killed a boy by mistake, and it broke you. You couldn't live with it. That's why you buried the gun." He leaned forward. "You're not a killer anymore. You're just a scared old man pretending to be dangerous." Jacob's jaw tightened. And then he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He lowered the gun. Dalton's smile returned. "There it is. You're right," Jacob said quietly. "I am scared. I've been scared for 3 years. Scared of this gun. Scared of what I'll do with it. Scared of who I'll hurt." He looked Dalton in the eyes. "But I'm more scared of what happens to Emma if I walk away." Jacob raised the gun again. And this time his hand was steady. Dalton's eyes widened. "Nobody has to die tonight," Jacob said. "You can walk out of this town. Right now. Leave the deeds. Leave the money. Disappear. And I'll let you live." Dalton stared at him for a long, frozen moment. Then his hand dropped toward his gun. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Jacob fired. The bullet caught Dalton in the shoulder, spinning him backward out of his chair. Carson roared and reached for his rifle. Jacob fired again, hitting Carson in the leg, dropping him. Reed flipped the table and scrambled for cover, drawing his revolver and firing wildly. Jacob dove behind a bar as bullets splintered the wood above his head. The hired guns scattered, 2 running for the stairs, 1 diving out the window. Jacob rose from behind a bar and fired twice more, forcing Reed back toward the wall. "Stop!" Dalton screamed from the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Stop shooting!" The room went silent except for the ringing echo of gunfire. Jacob stood slowly, the Colt still raised, smoke curling from barrel. Dalton stared up at him from the floor, his face pale with shock and pain. "You shot me," Dalton gasped. "You're still alive," Jacob said. "That was your one warning." He looked around the room at the hired guns frozen in place, at Carson writhing on the floor, at Reed pressed against the wall with his hands raised. "Next man who draws gets buried," Jacob said. Nobody moved. Jacob backed slowly toward the door, keeping the gun raised. "Town council is taking back the deeds," Jacob said. "Railroad negotiates with them. Not you. You're done here." He stepped out into the street. Behind him, the hired guns helped Dalton to his feet. Carson limped toward the door. Reed followed, hands still raised. Jacob stood in the center of the street, watching them mount their horses and ride out of town in the cold darkness, bleeding and broken and no longer a threat. The street slowly filled with people stepping out of their homes, watching the Crowley brothers disappear into the night. Emma appeared at Jacob's side, Sarah beside her. Jacob lowered the gun. His hands were shaking again, but this time it didn't matter. 3 days later, Jacob stood in front of the general store, saddling his horse. The town had tried to pay him. He refused. They had offered him a job as sheriff. He refused that too. He was leaving. Sarah Coltrane appeared on the porch of the store, Emma beside her. "You're going," Sarah said. "Yeah." "Where?" Jacob shrugged. "Somewhere quiet." Sarah stepped down into the street, Emma following close behind. "You saved this town," Sarah said. "You saved my life. Emma's life. And you won't even stay long enough to let us thank you properly." Jacob tightened the saddle cinch. "I didn't do anything special." "Yes, you did," Emma said suddenly. She stepped forward, looking up at him with those serious, too-old eyes. "You were scared. And you did it anyway." Jacob looked down at her. "That's what brave means, isn't it?" Emma asked. Jacob crouched down slowly to her level. "Yeah, kid," he said quietly. "I guess it is." Emma reached out and took his hand, the hand that was shaking slightly even now. "Will the shaking ever stop?" she asked. "I don't know," Jacob said honestly. "That's okay," Emma said. She squeezed his hand. "You don't have to be perfect to be a hero." Jacob felt something inside his chest break open, not painfully, but like a long frozen river finally thawing. He pulled Emma into a hug, holding the small, fierce girl who had ridden 15 miles alone to find him, who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. "Thank you," Jacob whispered. Emma pulled back, tears in her eyes but smiling. Sarah placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "If you ever need a place to call home," Sarah said, "you have one here." Jacob nodded, not trusting his voice. He stood, mounted his horse, and looked down at the two of them one last time. Then he rode north out of Salvation Ridge. Spring came early to Wyoming that year. Jacob Brennan returned to Cedar Falls, took his old job at the carpenter's shop, and went back to building fences and barns. But something had changed. His hands still shook sometimes. The nightmares still came. He still saw Colin Hayes' face in the dark. But he also saw Emma Coltrane's face. He heard her voice. "You don't have to be perfect to be a hero." One afternoon in late April, a letter arrived at the boarding house. It was from Sarah Coltrane. Inside was a drawing, done in a child's careful hand. It showed a man on a horse, a little girl standing beside him, and above them the words, "Thank you for saving us. Love, Emma." Jacob pinned the drawing to the wall of his room. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out the Colt. He didn't bury it again. He placed it on the table, cleaned and oiled it carefully, and put it in a holster on his belt. Because he understood something now that he hadn't understood before. The gun wasn't the problem. The fear wasn't the problem. The problem was believing that one mistake defined him forever. A month later, a rider came through Cedar Falls looking for a man named Jacob Brennan, a deputy marshal from Cheyenne with a federal badge and a problem. A gang of bank robbers was terrorizing towns along the Union Pacific line. They needed someone fast, someone with experience, someone who wasn't afraid to stand between the wolves and the people who couldn't defend themselves. Jacob listened. Then he saddled his horse, not because the fear was gone, but because the fear didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what you did when someone asked for help. As Jacob rode out of Cedar Falls toward Cheyenne, toward the next fight, toward the next impossible choice, he thought about a 10-year-old girl with dirt on her face and her father's blood on her dress, who had ridden through the wilderness alone because she believed the world could still be saved. And he decided she was right. What a powerful journey through fear, redemption, and the courage it takes to pick up the gun when your hands won't stop shaking. Jacob Brennan's story reminds us that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are. And sometimes the smallest voice, a 10-year-old girl holding out a gun she can barely carry, is the one that calls a broken warrior back to life. If Jacob's story of redemption and Emma's unbreakable courage moved you, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to be the hero someone needs. Subscribe and ring the bell, because our next Wild West story is already waiting for you in the valley. Drop a comment below. What hit you the hardest? Was it Emma handing Jacob the gun? Jacob steadying his hands in the final fight? Or the moment Emma told him he didn't have to be perfect? We'll see you in the next story, partner. Cowboy Hat Face.